Hey, how you all doing today? Hope everybody's doing well. Uh, we'll do two lectures this week um, on U.S. foreign policy. Today we'll just kind of talk about some basics, our military presence around the world, look at some theories about why the United States finds themselves involved in military conflicts so frequently, and then we'll talk about Donald Trump's foreign policy, the highlights of that in our next lecture, um, which I'll post that one on Thursday. Um, so, you guys are probably aware that the United States gets involved militarily uh, very frequently. Um, to give you guys kind of an idea, we have military bases in 65 countries, right, as we speak. And the number of bases depends on how you calculate it. Some say we have a minimum of 1,000 military bases around the world, but it could be as high as 1,200 if you count the amount of bases that we also rent or lease from allied countries. Where are the majority of our bases located? I mean, everywhere around the world, as we said, 65 countries. But we have a heavy influence in the Middle East, of course. Nations like Saudi Arabia, Iraq. We lease a base in Israel. Um, we have bases in Turkey, in Yemen. So, we have a heavy military presence in that part of the world. Southeast Asia, we have uh, quite a few military bases. Um, so they're scattered pretty much everywhere, right? Now, one question we have to ask, right, is why does the United States have so many military bases, and why are we so involved in world affairs militarily? So, um, there's a couple theories, right? More mainstream theories say, well, one reason why we have such a strong military presence, which, by the way, the United States has consistently been at war, right, for much of its entire history, right? Which is pretty unusual for modern nations to be in some kind of military conflict. So why do we have such a sprawling military base apparatus? Why are we so involved militarily in world affairs? Um, so there's a couple theories. One is national security, right? This is a mainstream theory. You guys have probably heard this term that as the world's superpower, there's always threats to U.S. interests, and now we have to maintain a strong military presence in order to be ready to ward off any competitors to U.S. power and to protect our interests. The most common thing today that we hear about national security is, of course, terrorism, right? Since 9/11, almost all of our military interventions under Bush Jr., under Obama, and even under Trump have been under the skies of preventing or stopping terrorism, right? So, national security is one reason we get so involved, at least we've been told, right? Human rights, that's another major thing. We've all been taught that the United States gets involved heavily militarily to promote human rights. And one of the most um, common wars that we're all taught is World War II, that predominantly had to do with human rights, preventing, um, Adolf Hitler from gaining supreme power over the world and to respond to the Nazi Holocaust. Though it should be noted, the United States didn't even get involved into the war until 1941 after Pearl Harbor, and Hitler's Nazi concentration camps were already well underway by that point, right? Another reason that we've been taught why the United States gets involved militarily is to promote democracy abroad, right? We've all been taught, right, that open markets and capitalism reigns supreme to any other type of political or economic system. So we've been taught that the United States routinely has to get involved to keep the world safe for democracy, right? So this was one of the justifications for why we went to Vietnam. You know, the North Vietnam, the Viet Cong were a communist regime, and we told the American people that we needed to make Vietnam safe for democracy again because they were under supposedly a despotic communist ruler. Now, of course, there, right, no one really stops to tell you about some of the more hidden motives for why we were in Vietnam, which we'll get to in a second. So, the national security, human rights, promoting democracy are the three kind of mainstream theories about why we get involved militarily so much. Um, and That's usually what's taught in our history textbooks to the students. That's what our politicians tell us when they're getting ready to go to war, Republican or Democrat. Um, and that's what the media promotes. I don't care if you're watching Fox News, which is more conservative, or MSNBC, which is more liberal. They all pretty much use these three reasons: human rights, national security, and the promotion of democracy abroad as reasons for going to war. They sound good, right? And I'm not saying there isn't times where that may be one of the considerations. Certainly, like Somalia, you guys may have heard the movie Black Hawk Down, right? Somalia, it was an intervention in the early 90s, and that had to do more or less with human rights. We were trying to stop a warlord from essentially asserting his power over a lawless Somalia. They had no government, right, at the time. And you can certainly look at other instances from history. But there are a lot of hidden motives, and here's a few of them. The protection of corporate interests, right? The United States has a really long past of getting involved in other nations' affairs to promote the interests of big corporations, right? We've even overthrown governments who have been unfriendly to U.S. corporations. We overthrew a democratically elected government in the 1950s in Guatemala because they were threatening to nationalize or overregulate our big banana corporation, United Fruit. We even took over Hawaii in the late 19th and early 20th centuries over pineapples because they were threatening to not allow our pineapple corporations in. The United States overthrew, with Britain's help, a democratically elected government in Iran because he was threatening to nationalize or overregulate, in our perception, our oil companies that were there. And definitely look at the Iraq War in 2003 under Bush Jr. That had everything to do with oil. In fact, immediately after we seized control and removed Saddam Hussein from power, the five most powerful oil corporations in America immediately gained a stronghold in that region and tripled and quadrupled their profits almost overnight, right? Once it was turned over to private hands. Um, you know, uh, the list goes on and on with the link between the protection of corporate interests and our foreign policy, right? Another reason that we get involved that's kind of more hidden, right, is this idea of empire, right? The need to promote our own power abroad to prevent any other competitors from challenging American supremacy, right? And you guys are going to be watching this clip this week from Howard Zinn, he's passed away since about 10 years back, but he was a historian from Boston University and also a World War II veteran. So he has a interesting credentials here. And he says America's main reason for getting involved anywhere has always been about world domination or what we might term empire, the need to control other nations' resources and governments for our own benefit. Finally, another hidden motive for why we get involved is the idea of resource control, right? The United States has always been obsessed with controlling other nations' resources for its own economic gain. Of course, capitalism, right, revolves around massive resource extraction, right? Put another way, it revolves on exploitation of the Earth's treasures, right? So the U.S. has always been involved for resource control. Vietnam was a great example of this. Vietnam, it came out in secret memos that our hidden motive over there was to gain control over rubber and tin and zinc, right? Major, um, major minerals, right? That we want to control over. Now, there's another reason why we get involved, and it's called the military industrial complex. But I'm going to do a separate lecture on that altogether. In fact, maybe now that I'm thinking, we'll do 3 lectures, or it's 2 lectures, but I'll weave the military industrial complex into the next one. I hope you guys be well and take care.